Welcome back. I'm Chantal Warner, one of the two co-directors of Circle. On behalf of myself and my colleagues, I hope you've all been having a wonderful conference. I know we've really enjoyed having you all here and getting to see all of your talks and all of your work. It's my pleasure now to introduce our final plenary speaker, Marianne Larsen. Marianne Larsen is a professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University in London, Canada. She's worked extensively in the fields of comparative and international education, and her work in this area addresses a range of topics, including institutional dimensions of internationalization, international service learning, and more recently, the role of academics who research and teach abroad as subjects of internationalization processes. Throughout this body of work, she's been concerned with the very notion of global citizenship education and how it's realized in and through various aspects of higher education. Her 2016 book, Internationalization of Higher Education, an analysis through spatial, network, and mobilities, takes the topic we've selected for this year's conference head on and asks us to challenge some of the most taken for granted assumptions about what it means to internationalize institutions of higher education. In particular, she critically examines the idea of global citizenship as an assumed objective of internationalization, a theme we've heard throughout this conference and which I think she's going to prompt us to think even harder about in this talk. So her talk with us this afternoon is Internationalization of Higher Education, Moving Towards Global Learning for All. Please join me in welcoming Marianne Larsen.
Thank you so much, Chantal, and thank you to Chantal and Beatrice and Kate for inviting me to come to the conference here and serve as a keynote speaker. Thank you all for being here and taking time out of your Saturday after a long day of being in workshops and presenting and being in audiences. I really do appreciate that very much. It's good to be back in the American Southwest. I'm from Canada, and 25 years ago, as a foolish young teacher, I was a Fulbright scholar on a teacher exchange program, and I taught in El Paso, Texas for a year, right on the border. And I learned so much in that 1 year from those students and the people of the Southwest, and I fell in love with the land in the Southwest. I know El Paso and Tucson are different places, but they have always had a special place in my heart. So get my slides up here. Here we go. So one of the things I've been so struck by in coming back are these majestic, amazing saguaro cacti plants. And I'm just in awe as I look out in the hotel here, and I went for a walk in Sabino Canyon to see how they stand so tall and so great. And so my story begins here in this place. And traditionally, as many of you know, the local indigenous peoples from the Tohono O'odham Nation gathered the ripe saguaro fruit and harvested it for both food and for religious ceremonies, as you can see in the photo here, which is about 100 years old. And what this photo reminds us of is the long-standing presence of the Tohono O'odham despite a century or more of practices of cultural genocide, a story which is a global story. And one of the things that I talk about in my research is the problem with the binaries between local and global, because the global is always situated in the local, in a local setting. And so this is a global story. It is a global story, but it is situated within this place and in a particular time. But it's also really important to know that it's not just, these aren't just historical artifacts. Today, young Tohono O'odham people are being taught by elders and knowledge keepers again about the harvesting of the saguaro fruit and using the food and using the fruit for religious purposes as well. Keeping alive that ancient knowledge and tradition, and demonstrating for everybody the continuing presence of the First Nations people on the land and the long-standing stewardship of that land. So I was taught by an elder in Canada, an Anishinaabe elder, that whenever you do land acknowledgements, try and make them personal. So this is a story that stems from my own walking and being in the land over the last few days. So I dedicate this presentation to the First Peoples of this area and their stewardship of the land and that we still are able to enjoy today. All righty, on to the presentation. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk broadly about internationalization and some of the motivations or rationales or what people call drivers of internationalization. Many of you know this history and this story, and some of you may not. So I'm sort of casting the net wide in terms of what I'm going to be talking about initially. And we can think about the three of the main drivers of internationalization of higher education being massification of higher education, economic, financial, commercial reasons or rationales, and political. There are other drivers, and I'll get to those a little later in the presentation. I am then going to talk broadly again about some of the ways that universities internationalize, and generally speaking, people divide internationalization activities into internationalization at home and internationalization abroad. Again, problems with the binary, I'll get back to that. I'll focus in the presentation on academic mobility, that is students and faculty going abroad through study abroad programs, teaching abroad for academics, international service learning, and other kinds of volunteer work. And then I would like to draw your attention particularly to the inequalities inherent in those particular aspects of internationalization, the study abroad service learning piece. I'll then move to talking about the other drivers or motivations of internationalization, and those we can say are educational and socio-cultural. And in the last part of the presentation, I'll talk about global learning for all. The main point that I'd like to illustrate through my talk is that while much of what goes on under the umbrella, under the name of internationalization, has been driven by economic and to some degree political rationales, and as a result of that, those particular forms of internationalization have resulted in a lot of inequalities in terms of who's been able to benefit and who has not been able to benefit from those kinds of international activities. I still maintain that there's considerable value in focusing on the international and in the global in higher education institutions, but only if we do it by taking into consideration the social, cultural, and educational motivations or rationales for internationalization. So you've heard a lot in this conference about internationalization and what it is. Foskett says that internationalization reaches to the very heart of the meaning of the university and to every facet now of its operation. When you hear about universities developing internationalization strategic plans, or when I hear about it, I roll my eyes and go, oh yeah, here we go, another one. And so it's become a trend, and a lot of institutions are jumping on that bandwagon. The definition that you see here is a very typical one that Jane Knight came up with a number of years ago. It has been critiqued for a number of reasons, being narrow, being instrumental, and there's been other definitions that have been developed. This one is a definition from Hans de Witt and a number of other scholars where he makes a case, and I think it's an important point here, that internationalization ought to be considered the intentional process of integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, function, and delivery of post-secondary education. And here's the important part, and it's highlighted in red. In order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. And the shift here in that definition compared to Knight's definition there is it's more normative in talking about what internationalization should be, what it ought to be, what is the potential of internationalization. And it's at the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. So why internationalize? I have written about, and many others have, that there's a long history of higher education institutions and people within them being international. We can go right back to Socrates and early peripatetic scholars who traveled in order to learn. And so we know that that is a fact. But the recent manifestation of internationalization is very much a response to broader processes largely known as globalization in society. And many argue that internationalization is a response to globalization. Again, quoting from DeWitt, Hans DeWitt, in a recent article, he writes, "Rapid changes are taking place in international higher education, which only have increased in range and complexity over the past decade. Key changes globally are massification, economic pressures, and the global knowledge economy, and the emphasis on reputation and ranking." So let's unpack that a little bit further. One of the main reasons why universities are developing strategic plans around internationalization today has to do with the massification of higher education. Once the privilege of an elite social class, gross enrollment ratios, GRE, in higher education have increased to more than 50% in many countries. Emerging economies such as China, India, and countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are expanding their GREs to over 50%, as is common in most of the so-called developed world. And massification of higher ed is also rapidly increasing in African countries. So there's a demand for higher education, and a lot of that has to do with growing middle class. On the other hand, there is a saturation in demand in countries which have already moved beyond the 50% rate. So that's in Canada, the UK, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And in those countries, for demographic and other reasons, the supply of places in higher education, particularly in STEM fields, is starting to be higher than demand. So the relationship between massification and internationalization is clear. International students and scholars are needed to fill the demand for graduates in those fields, in the STEM fields, and those students mainly are coming from so-called developing or emerging economies where there is an ongoing demand for quality higher education. That results in an increase in international students in countries like the US and Canada, and brain drain in the countries from which those students come. There are other reasons for the internationalization of higher education, and one of the main ones we can say are economic or commercial drivers or reasons. Altbach and Knight argue that earning money is a key motive for all internationalization projects in the for-profit sector and also in the nonprofit university sector. So what are the ways that universities can get money from internationalization? Well, the most obvious is recruiting high-fee paying international students, which is related to the massification that I just talked, the massification of higher education, which I just talked about. So these students pay high fees, they contribute a lot to the local economies, and as well they work often as graduate assistants or research assistants and contribute to the university in that way. But there's many other sort of economic ways that universities can make money through internationalization. My own university and my Faculty of Education, we've developed hundreds of online graduate programs, and most of them are taught by contract faculty at a considerable lower rate than tenured permanent faculty. And there are dozens of other examples, some of which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And all of these are aimed to make money. That's basically what that is about. Some people refer to this as academic capitalism or the marketization of higher education. These processes are also political. And what I mean by that is that internationalization processes are embedded in power relations at the institutional, the national, and the global level. And I want to talk about the politics of internationalization in terms of university rankings. Because of massification, and these are all connected, universities have to compete for international students, or for domestic students as well. And they do that by trying to go higher up in the ranking schemes. And there are national ranking schemes, and there are also global ranking schemes. And two of the main global ranking schemes are the Times Higher Education ranking system and the QS ranking system out of Shanghai. And those particular ranking systems privilege the international, such that institutions, universities, that have higher numbers of international students, higher numbers of international faculty, higher numbers of faculty that publish in international, i.e. Western journals, higher numbers of faculty that publish in an international language, English, that's the way it's understood. Those universities score higher in the rankings, and therefore they go up, and more students come to them, and so on and so forth. So there's a relationship between the striving for very narrowly defined forms of excellence that we see in these rankings and internationalization. And they reflect a competitive nature of internationalization. This is what Yudkovich, Altbach, and Rumbley call the global academic rankings game. And it is a game, it's a competition. So how do universities internationalize? Well, there's many different ways, and I've mentioned quite a few of them already. And generally, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, people divide it into internationalization at home and internationalization abroad. It's really problematic because many things are both. But generally speaking, we can think about internationalization at home as being related to internationalizing the curriculum. And this stemmed from the adaptation of intercultural studies to higher education, which of course is of great interest to people you, participants in this conference. And internationalization at home generally takes into account the cultural diversity of the university and aims to develop in students global competencies, cross-cultural communication skills, intercultural competencies, and so on. But for most of the recent history of internationalization, internationalization at home has taken the back seat to internationalization abroad. And internationalization abroad generally refers to everything that has to do with people and programs crossing borders in some way. So we can think about international research partnerships, establishing programs abroad like branch campuses or double degree programs, and also study abroad and international service learning as being examples of internationalization abroad. Some people refer to internationalization at home as being inwardly focused and internationalization abroad being outwardly focused. So let's take a look at the University of Arizona as a case study, which was a lot of fun for me to do. Got all the brochures here. The university, there's a lot of examples, so it was pretty interesting for me to go on the website and see what's going on at UA. And they write on the website, UA Global develops and maintains partnerships with universities and institutions around the world, from student mobility programs to research collaboration. The International Partnership Team, rah-rah, at UA Global supports the mission of UA to redefine what it means to be an international university in the 21st century. And there's loads of examples, and I have some of them up here on the slides, and when you get the slides later, if you're interested and aren't from UA, or if you are, you can click on the different links here. So there's dual degree programs, and that's basically where a student enrolls in two universities, the UA and another university outside of the US, in a degree program, and they fulfill degree requirements in both institutions and gain 2 degrees as a result of that. The most interesting to me is the micro-campus network. Very glossy, and I'm not working for UA by promoting this, by the way. Glossy brochure here. So micro-campuses are fascinating to me. Sorry. Basically, a student in another country, so there are UA campuses in other countries around the world, where a student in those countries can attend a UA program and get a UA degree. So there is a film and television program in Manila, Philippines. So students in the Philippines can get a UA degree by not leaving home. There's an engineering bachelor's degree in Iraq. And again, students in Iraq don't have to leave home. And this is the problem with differentiating between internationalization abroad and internationalization at home. For those students, they're at home. but that is considered here an example of internationalization abroad. So, you know, just troubling that a little bit is important to do. Above all, UA has many, many different study abroad programs, and this is not unlike many other universities, including my own. There's hundreds of programs, and they claim on the website that students go on these programs in there's 60 countries that they have opportunities to. There's Arizona abroad locations where students study at partner institutions around the world. There's faculty-led programs and exchange programs. So these are all examples of internationalization abroad. And as I've heard in this conference, many universities have been pouring a lot of money into seeing that students have these kinds of opportunities to go abroad, with the argument that students, by participating in these study abroad or international service learning programs, they will develop global competencies. Critics, however, argue that students participate in these programs for economic reasons. The corporate world has said that we need to have employees that have intercultural skills, global competencies, this is good for business, and students know that having that on their CV, that they've been abroad and a part of a study abroad program, will be a ticket to being able to compete more in the global knowledge economy. I think it can be both. I think it could also, it's not an either-or situation here. So this is the new reality for students navigating the global job market. The problem for me is this: not everyone has the opportunity to go abroad or engage in international student service learning. And these individuals are excluded from further future opportunities in the global economy. First, let's consider how students of color are often excluded from these opportunities. So what you have here on this slide is a table with data from 2017-2018 of the percent of US study abroad students by race and ethnicity. In the first column is a list of major ethnic racial groups in the US: African American, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Caucasian, and so on. The second column has data on the percentage enrollment of each of those groups. So African American, 13.6% enrolled in higher ed. Caucasian, 56%. But take a look at the third column. That's the data of the percentage of each of those racial ethnic groups who participated in study abroad programs in the US. And you can see automatically the inequities that are clear. While Caucasian students of Caucasian background make up just over half of the percent total enrollment of students, 70% of them are participants in study abroad programs. So there are inequalities. And we also know from research, some of my own with international service learning, that racialized students have very different experiences from non-racialized students in study abroad and engaging, as I said, in international service learning programs. They face discrimination and forms of othering, including being exoticized by locals in the communities in which they're studying, serving, and living. And I see nods around the table. There are other inequalities to consider here, and that has to do with the overall numbers. You're going to find this, as I always do, surprising, and it's a really important, this is the most important slide as far as I'm concerned. You might think, with all the talk about study abroad, that nearly all students are going abroad. It is a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of students who actually participate in study abroad programs. Nationally, the number of US students studying abroad for credit in 2017-2018 grew 2.7%. I won't tell you the figures, but to almost 342,000 students. That is only 1.7% of all US students enrolled in a post-secondary education who studied abroad that year. In Arizona, the numbers are worse. It's less than 1% of students, 0.88% of students studied abroad. And so I wonder why we keep talking about study abroad all the time when the vast majority of students don't have those opportunities. And we know that the students who are able to go abroad are the students who already are very privileged economically, because their families and those students have the money and the resources for them to be able to participate in those study abroad programs. Canada, by the way, if you're interested, is 3%, and Europe, it's about 8 or 9% of students who actually study abroad, much, much, much higher. So let me shift now and tell you a little bit about my own research on academic mobility. That's the mobility of faculty and some of the barriers they face in being able to go abroad. So there are many, so first of all, faculty, professors, academic staff are encouraged to go abroad to participate in international initiatives as a part of their work. It is seen as being the mark of a good academic. And so you see up in the slide here some examples of what that means for faculty members. So studying and teaching abroad, engaging in international research collaborations or partnerships, attending international conferences like this. In my own institution, we have metrics around performance appraisal every year. And I am rated higher if I attend a conference outside of Canada than I am if I attend a conference within Canada. I get points and I get merit pay based on, and I get more merit pay if I have international publications as well. And transnational academic exchanges. So my own study about academic mobility, in it, I took what is called a micro-perspective approach to understand the individual stories, the individual experiences of academics who both traveled for their work, faced pressures to do so, and also faced barriers in being able to do so. There was a survey, initial survey to get basic demographic data, and then I did interviews with each of these academics. So there were 16 in the study, 8 males and 8 females that I interviewed, and half of them had children living at home, and that piece is important. I'm going to come back to that. And they came from a wide range of geographical locations. I interviewed people who were based in the US, Canada, Cuba, Australia, India, Israel, 2 Eastern European countries, 2 Northern European countries, and the UK and Japan. So people, and faculty, and academics from a wide range of disciplines as well. With the exception of 1 scholar from Cuba, they had all engaged in various forms of transnational scholarly mobility, and they all faced barriers in their efforts to be mobile for their work. Let me tell you some of their stories. When I unpacked the data, I was able to divide the participants, and this wasn't something that I had planned. That's just what happened when I was analyzing the data, into these 5 different categories. Can I get an idea of how much time where I'm at? 19 minutes. Oh, great. Okay, so I can tell you some stories. So in the first group, that's precarious workers, people on short-term contract, limited-term duty contracts had children at home. So I had interviewed 2 people in that category. One of them, Sarah, was from Germany. She was married. She had 2 young children at home, and she'd done her Ph.D. in the US. And she just went from one short-term contract to another in Germany, in the US, and in other countries within Europe. And she just said that was just what she had to do in order to try and get a long-term permanent position. I interviewed 3 participants who were what we might call early career with children at home. And I'll tell you a little bit about Mary. Mary was originally from Russia, but when I interviewed her, she was working in Israel as an associate professor. Interestingly, she's now in Berlin on another short-term contract. At the time I interviewed her, she had 2 young children, and she was the main caregiver for them. She traveled a lot for her work, of research meetings, conferences, graduate supervision abroad, and she noted that Israeli academics are urged to engage in international scholarly work. She said, "The idea that the academic needs to be connected to the outer world. Academia in Israel is very internationalized. More than half of the articles published are published with international partners. Many of my colleagues have gone abroad for their sabbaticals." 3 of the participants were mid-career professors between the ages of 35 and 44 with young children at home. Let me tell you about Dina. She was originally from Chile, but she was now working, when I interviewed her, in Australia. She was separated from her partner and did the majority of childcare for their 6-year-old son. She had completed her Ph.D. in the United Kingdom, so she'd been all over the place. She had a lecturer position, and a part of her professional responsibility, she had engaged in many travel abroad opportunities, conferences, and short-term teaching abroad. And she said, if you want to progress as an academic, you're expected to engage in international collaborations and be part of those exchanges that happen at conferences. 4 participants in the study were early mid-career, and they didn't have children at home. Karina, for example, originally from Austria, when I interviewed her, she was working in Japan. After completing her PhD in the US, she first had a short-term contract in Spain, and she didn't have a lot of stability there, so she moved to China. She had a number of short-term jobs there, after which she moved to Japan, and she got a permanent position. So she had moved around a lot. And now, well, the last slide was kind of boring to look at, so I'll put a more interesting one up here. And I'll tell you about the last 2 participants. What I did here in this is I literally mapped out in my archaic way where my participants had traveled and where they were from and where they had traveled. So, and this is just 16 people. So the last set of participants were older, later career participants with no children at home. Robert from the US was probably the most mobile of the people that I talked to. He was from the US, he held several faculty positions over his 20-plus year career, and he was, at the time I interviewed him, doing research in the Bering Strait. It's very interesting. He had traveled all over the world, doing a lot of research contracts, and had worked in Cambodia for many years. At the other end of the spectrum, there was Paulo, also a full professor, like Robert from the US, and he was the head of a major program in the languages department in a Cuban university. And over the 20-plus years of his academic career, he had not traveled once outside of Cuba. And there are 2 main reasons for that. One, financial. The Cuban peso, the local peso used for Cubans, is practically worth nothing outside of Cuba. And 2, visas. So although he had wanted to and tried over the course of his career, he wasn't able to. So let's talk a little bit more, let's hear a little bit more about the barriers that these people talked about. I just mentioned Paulo and the financial barrier that he faced. Well, many of the people that I spoke to in my study also talked about the financial barriers they faced, financial barriers related to the cost of transportation, flying abroad, the costs related to accommodation, conference registration and membership costs, and childcare, either bringing your kids with you and paying for childcare or having to arrange childcare at home. And with the exception of the 2 Canadian participants for whom it didn't cost as much to, for example, travel to the United States, and many people I talked to wish to come to the US for going to academic conferences because some of the biggest conferences are there or in continental Europe. But Dina in Australia, she said, it's going to cost me over 4,000 Australian dollars to fly and stay in the US for a couple of weeks, and my university doesn't give me that kind of money, and what am I going to do about my 6-year-old son when I'm away? And so it just wasn't possible for her. They also talked about personal barriers, and these are mainly related to family and caregiver responsibilities. I'm going to tell you about Christina. Christina was a young Polish academic, and she was in tears when I interviewed her. I did it through Skype. In Poland, like in many countries, there's a tenure process. They call it habilitation in Poland, and you have 8 years to prove yourself in terms of your research and your teaching and your service. But in Poland, you need to engage in international research partnerships and go abroad to do that. And she says she just couldn't do it because she has 2 young children at home and is the main caregiver. And you can read her quote on the slide here. And she says, when I've highlighted, for her, it was impossible because she had 2 young children. She talked a lot about working all day, coming home, and anybody who has kids knows, like, they're demanding and there's a lot to do in terms of childcare. The idea of being able to go away for a couple of weeks was completely out of the picture for her. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just females who talked about that. I interviewed a number of men who either were separated or divorced from their partners, and they had young children, and they took their childcare responsibilities and desire to spend time and be with their kids very seriously. And so they also gave up opportunities to travel abroad or move abroad for their work. There were institutional barriers that the faculty talked about related to work demands and pressures and teaching schedules. So some of them talked about the fact that they both were expected to go abroad, but they also were expected to stay and report in at the office and be there all the time. Some of them talked about teaching schedules conflicting with the time when conferences were going on that they usually attended that were central conferences in their field for their academic and research areas. Attending to the barriers that academics face in their attempts to travel abroad for their professional work shows us how mobility can stratify the academic profession, setting out positions between those who can move and go abroad for their work and be mobile and those who cannot. Those who are able to go abroad and participate in these international activities are considered better academics. Developing a global mindset, participating in international activities, makes what is called an attractive research career. And I would argue it's the same case for students, as I mentioned earlier, who want to add their study abroad experience or their service learning experience to their CV as proof of their global and intercultural competencies. These unequal opportunities to go abroad can be considered forms of asymmetric mobility, as you can see from the quote here on the slide from Giorgio and Ruffini. This selective nature of academic mobility contributes further to inequalities within the academic profession. And I would argue that these mobility exclusions are experienced, again, by faculty and by students. This leads to what the writer Shamir calls the mobility gap. While some have the power to be mobile and exercise that, and others are prevented from doing so. And they're like Winnie the Pooh in the image here, stuck, unable to move. And that was a term that 2 of my participants talked about, feeling stuck, unable to participate in what they've been told are these wonderful opportunities to study, research, teach, and serve abroad. Let's go back to what I talked about earlier about the reasons why we have internationalization. I talked earlier in the presentation about the economic and political drivers associated with the internationalization of higher education. But we can also think about academic and social cultural drivers. Academic drivers include the desire to enhance research through international collaboration and to broaden knowledge production and knowledge mobilization. And social cultural reasons or motivations include fostering intercultural competencies, understanding, global competencies, and global citizenship. These are what many, including Joseph Steer, quoted here, would say are idealistic motivations for internationalization, and I think they're the most important ones. Earlier, when I talked about the internationalization, I talked about the differences between internationalization at home and internationalization abroad. As you may recall, internationalization abroad generally refers to the movement of students, scholars, programs, and providers beyond political borders. And as we have seen, this is only available to a very small minority of students. Students are primarily white, primarily privileged in terms of social class. On the other hand, internationalization at home focuses on providing all students, regardless of their background, with the opportunities to develop a global mindset. And the curriculum is at the heart of this. Betty Leeks, who has written a lot on this topic, defines the internationalization of the curriculum as the process of incorporating international, intercultural, and global dimensions into the content of the curriculum, as well as the learning outcomes, assessment tasks, teaching methods, and support services of a program of study. There's been increasing emphasis on this aspect of internationalization. And I think that's good. And I've heard a lot about it at this conference, and I was really pleased to see that. But this means that we are not internationalized. If we go this route, it means we're not internationalizing for a minority, a very small minority, but we're internationalizing for all. And I strongly believe we can only do this by shifting our attention away from internationalization abroad to internationalization at home through the curriculum, with a focus on global learning for all. Challenging the dominant economic discourse of internationalization, I think we need to consider alternative, more socially just and inclusive ways of internationalizing our campuses. Again, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but we know statistically that only a minimum of students engage in study abroad. And there are other gaps in terms of class and race, in terms of who's able to go abroad and who's not. And we know that students and faculty face many barriers to being able to go abroad. And for faculty, as my research has shown, these barriers are disproportionately faced by faculty in the Global South, female faculty, and early career precarious faculty. Thus, I think it's imperative for higher education institutions to consider the ways in which we can provide opportunities for all students, staff and faculty to become global learners, without needing to physically travel abroad. In their book, which I have here, is a 2018 book called Making Global Learning Universal. The authors Hilary Landorf, Stephanie Dorscher, and Jasif Hardrick from the Florida International University, FIU, used the idea of a map to explain what global learning is. They didn't pay me to do this, but I highly recommend this book. And they explain, you might not be able to see, but the pictures on the front are students looking at maps and talking about the maps. And I'm going to use the words of the authors to explain to you what's going on there and how they use that to explain what global learning means. These are FIU undergrads participating in a strategy of global learning. They're comparing and contrasting diverse maps of the world, interpreting information the maps present, and interrogating their symbolic meaning. The students are provided with opportunities to question what the maps represent, the implications of different ways of representing the worlds and our common planet is portrayed. In their conversation, global learning begins. It's in that place. Together, the students slowly realize that the process of developing a more authentic, nuanced understanding of the world is a complex problem that needs to be solved. Global learning, according to the authors, is the process of diverse people collaboratively analyzing and addressing complex problems that transcend national borders. It enables students to understand and make connections between local and global concerns and analyze pressing issues from multiple global perspectives. It involves collaborative efforts to grapple with real-world problems influencing local and global communities. So let's go back to UA. I don't want to just diss UA, and maybe that sounded like I was doing that earlier. Let's take a look at some of the opportunities for internationalization at home as a case study to see how one institution has been doing it. UA has what's called a 100% engagement initiative, which is based on the recognition that experiences within and beyond the classroom can provide opportunities for all students to enrich their professional and personal growth. And I found it quite interesting to look at two examples from UA. One is the UA Refugee Project, where UA students are provided with opportunities to build their intercultural competency and skills by volunteering within Tucson to serve the needs of the approximate 800 refugees who live within the city of Tucson. And the Global Ambassador Program is a leadership program for UA students interested in bridging cultures between US students and international students and serving as ambassadors for international and global community on campus. So I think there's some really good things going on here under the umbrella of global learning for all. This is my final slide. Early in my presentation, I shared with you some thoughts about the broader context within which internationalization has taken place related to globalization. The massification of higher education has also played a role in increasing the numbers of students studying abroad, especially from countries like China and India. There are also economic reasons associated with internationalization. As universities struggle to make ends meet financially, they're lured down the path of accepting increasing numbers of high fee-paying international students. And politics are involved in all of this. Specifically, I talked about global rankings that have played a political role in pitting universities one against the other in the race to emerge at the top of the global ranking scales. And many of these universities are privileged, the ones that are seen as being more international, i.e. more Western and more English. After walking you through the different motivations underpinning internationalization, I noted that there's two main ways that universities have internationalized, at home and abroad. And these categories are problematic in the assumption that we can divide what goes on to being at home and abroad, but it's a somewhat useful framework to use. I used UA as a case study to demonstrate the different ways that a university can internationalize, talked about microcampus network, and study and service abroad opportunities. And then I drew your attention to the very real inequalities that exist in terms of who has opportunities to go abroad and who has not. I shared with you some results from my recent research on academic mobility, drawing your attention to the barriers that faculty members in countries around the world face in their desire to go abroad for their work. Internationalization abroad, I would argue, has created divisions and inequalities between those who've been able to participate in these opportunities outside of their own home country and those who have not. I ended the presentation bringing you back around to a discussion about why universities internationalize, and I suggest that we consider the educational and socio-cultural rationales for internationalization, which I believe have a much stronger potential to alleviate inequalities in our world and contribute to peace building. One way to operationalize internationalization at home is through the curriculum, and it's very fitting that I'm making this argument here at this conference with the theme, internationalizing the curriculum. Over the last few days, I've had the opportunity to hear many wonderful presentations from you about teaching intercultural competence, cultural pedagogy, ways the curriculum across different subjects and disciplines can be internationalized, and so on. I think what you're talking about is global learning for all. Not global learning for a minority, not global learning because you're white or from an upper class background or because of your gender, but global learning for all. Global learning is a way for universities to reclaim the social, cultural, and educational potential of internationalization, and a way to understand how complex problems transcend national borders and develop solutions to seemingly intractable problems the world faces today. Through global learning for all, higher education, I believe, can contribute to the creation of a more inclusive, equitable, socially, and ecologically just world. Thank you. I think there's time for questions.
Yes. Is that on? Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I would assume that most people here will certainly agree with everything you said. It makes me think about something. We're talking about internationalization, and if I think of interculturalization, not everybody goes abroad, but there are ways that we can include our colleagues who work with diversity locally. And what we learn abroad in terms of intercultural communicative competence often translates back into better interpersonal competence. So what I'm thinking is, how do we utilize our own diversity locally on campus and address intercultural competence locally without going across a border? It's a thought that is very important because it's a way to expand this kind of experience to everyone. Thank you.
All I have to say is I agree. I mean, I think we just need to start doing it and building those connections with people working on our campuses. I mean, cultural diversity exists within our campuses already, especially in North American universities and community colleges. Thank you.
if you compare Canada to the US in terms of barriers, what differences are there?
Oh boy. Some people use the terms a melting pot versus a mosaic to differentiate Canada from the US in terms of the immigrant population in the country. In other words, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but they say that in the US it's important that it's a melting pot, that people come from all these different countries and become American, and the pot and everybody's mixed up, and out comes an American. I'm simplifying here. And that in Canada, we have an official multiculturalism policy, that goes back to 1970s in our country, where immigrants are encouraged to maintain their cultural heritage. So students, for example, in Canada have heritage language classes they can go to on the weekend. So if you're an immigrant from, I'm going to say, my father's from Denmark, but that's not a good example because there's no Danish heritage language classes. But from Italy, for example, students can learn Italian and maintain their mother tongue and also be considered Canadian. The hyphenated Italian Canadian is not seen as being derogatory, it's seen as being the heart. As I said, I'm not convinced that that is the best way to distinguish between the two countries. I think there's many similarities. I don't know what else to talk about. I mean, there's so many different topics that we could go down that route of politics, for example, and I'm not sure I want to go there right now, but Canada is, many people would say, a more liberal country politically compared to the United States. But in many respects, we share the same commitment to social democracy as well.
Thank you for that presentation. So my question is more practical. What would be your advice for graduate students who are interested in promoting global learning and intercultural competence that is, attractive for us to continue in this pursuit, because like every time you talk to a professor with a permanent position, everything you hear is just discouragement, like, oh no, this is so awful, and the university has so many rules, and everything's about tenure, and sometimes as a graduate student, you feel like, geez, do I really want to get into this? And I don't know if professors realize that sometimes they send this message of, think about it, What would be your advice?
So do you mean my advice for professors that are teaching graduate students, or for graduate students and advice around global learning for all? I mean, I think everybody benefits regardless of where you are in the university, whether you're a first-year undergrad student or a doctoral student about to finish your Ph.D. or a staff member working in an administrative role or a tenured professor. Everybody benefits from being able to understand that there's multiple perspectives on various issues, that we gain so much more by engaging with people who are different from ourselves, that it's important to learn about how things are done and how people think and how knowledge is produced outside of the world in which we live. I think, to me, those are skills and ways of being in the world that benefit everybody regardless of where they are. And they can't, I've been on a number of hiring committees, and I don't think the US is much different from Canada in this respect. We're looking for people who have those kind of competencies when we're hiring. We want people who are new professors out of graduate school who not only understand that there's different ways, different values, different cultural values, but respect that, because our student body is international, or not just international, it's diverse as well. So I don't think I'm answering your question directly, but I think that I would emphasize whatever competencies you have when you're going to look for jobs, if that's where you're at. And I think that's a really important skill to to use to promote who you are and to do the kind of work that you're going to want to do in higher ed. There's still hope. It's not all bad. I don't think so. There's a lot of great potential in higher ed. I've seen it here in this conference. It's really, really remarkable and heartening.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just as global learning is a trend of globalization, there's also a global governance system. For example, the United Nations or the OECD. So I was wondering, how would you frame your view within the global governance system? For example, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, in particular goals number 4 and 8, which aim for quality education and the reduction of inequalities, starting at the global level but with an impact at the local level.
I don't think there's any contradiction between what you just said and what I said in my presentation. In fact, we see this push around global citizenship, intercultural learning from the top levels of the UN. The SDGs certainly make this commitment and frame it as quality learning. I think we're talking about the same thing. I really do. And some of the best materials around global learning, global citizenship, intercultural learning come from UNICEF and from the UN. Just look at their websites, and a very strong commitment. You know, some people might argue that it's just words, but we have to take those words and make corresponding actions to go along with it to make them real. So thanks for bringing that up, but I think we're absolutely talking about the same thing.
Perhaps more synergy among the stakeholders at the end.
Absolutely.
Okay, that is all the time we have for questions, but we can continue this discussion at the reception afterwards. Before we go to that wonderful reception, I'm going to pass this back to Chantal Werner, who has a few words.
Yes, thank you. Can we actually thank Marianne Larsen one more time for her